Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable lives and incredible resilience of medieval peasants, the everyday heroes who, despite the odds, managed to survive some of the coldest and most brutal nights in history. From makeshift insulation tricks to communal sleeping strategies, their story is one of grit, ingenuity, and determination. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When you think of medieval life, you might imagine jousting knights, grand feasts, and merry fairs. But for the average peasant, winter was less about merriment and more about, how do we not die tonight? It wasn't just a season, it was a test of endurance that came around every year, like an especially cruel teacher who didn't believe in second chances. Picture this, you're living in a tiny mud and stick hut, with walls so thin you could probably hear a bird sneeze from outside. No insulation, no windows unless you count a small hole stuffed with animal skin, and definitely no thermostat wars with your siblings. The inside temperature of your home was usually just a polite couple of degrees above whatever the weather was doing outside. If it was freezing outdoors, it was politely slightly less freezing inside. Congratulations. Nights were the worst. Darkness swallowed everything. The wind howled like an angry ghost, and the fire in the hearth sputtered pathetically, doing its best but mostly just roasting the toes of whoever was sitting closest. If you were on the other side of the room, sorry, you might as well have been camping outside with worse snacks. Clothing wasn't much help either. Peasants didn't own fancy fur coats or goose-down blankets. You had a couple of rough spun wool tunics, maybe a cloak that smelled suspiciously of goat, and a hope that layering them would turn you into some kind of human onion. Spoiler, it didn't really work. And forget about snuggling under soft quilts.
Beds were often nothing more than sack stuffed with hay or straw, maybe with a few old rushes thrown in for good measure. And as a bonus, some fleas for extra company. Luxury, thy name is medieval peasant life. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Frostbite, hypothermia, and good old-fashioned freezing to death were constant risks, especially for young children and the elderly. Every morning you woke up still breathing was considered a minor miracle and honestly worth celebrating. Maybe with a slightly less frozen turnip for breakfast. Oh yes, surviving a medieval winter wasn't about comfort. It was about gritting your teeth, piling on every piece of cloth you owned, huddling with your livestock, and praying you didn't wake up with icicles hanging off your eyebrows. And the real adventure? It was just beginning that if you think your apartment is drafty because the window doesn't close properly, medieval peasants would like a word. Their homes weren't just drafty, they were basically enthusiastic wind tunnels with a roof. Most peasant houses were what historians politely call wattle and daub construction. Translation: sticks crisscrossed like a giant basket, smeared with a charming mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. Yes, dung. They weren't trying to be gross. Dung was a cheap, sticky insulator. Plus, let's just say it was always in stock. These walls, no matter how lovingly smeared, didn't stand much chance against a proper winter storm. Cold wind found every crack, every gap, and gleefully danced its way into the one-room homes, swirling around and making sure you never got too comfortable. Privacy? Absolutely not. Warmth? Not really. Character building? Definitely. And then there were the roofs. Thatched roofs looked picturesque, sure. But after a few months of rain and snow, they sagged, leaked, and occasionally let in the local wildlife. Nothing says pleasant evening like a squirrel dropping onto your dinner. Windows, if they existed at all, were laughably tiny, usually covered with thin animal hides or wooden shutters. Glass was so expensive that even the lord of the manor probably couldn't afford more than a single tiny pane. As for peasants, they were just happy if the wind didn't rip the cowhide right off the wall mid-dash blizzard. To make matters worse, Floors were often just compacted dirt. When it rained or snowed heavily, mud seeped up through the ground. So, technically, you could say they had indoor water features. Not that they appreciated in winter. Every step inside your own home could feel like trudging across a frozen marsh. Cold from below, cold from above, cold from inside. It was a three-dimensional assault on your body heat. But medieval peasants weren't the type to whine. They packed gaps with moss-jammed old rags into the worst drafts and huddled close to each other. Human insulation at its finest, creativity, stubbornness, and a bit of sheep grease rubbed into the walls were often the only things standing between them and becoming medieval popsicles. Because if your house was falling apart and your best protection against the elements involved mud and goat hair, well, at least you could laugh about it. Sort of. If your teeth weren't chattering too hard if the freezing air wasn't enough, medieval peasants also had to battle a silent enemy rising from below, the frozen ground itself. Floors weren't really floors back then. They were just slightly flatter patches of earth inside your home. Maybe if you were lucky, someone had thrown down some straw or old rushes to give you the illusion of comfort.
But make no mistake, you were sleeping just one uninsulated back away from the cold, hard dirt. And oh, that cold was relentless. It seeped up from the earth like an evil little ghost, worming its way through the straw into your bones, and straight into your very soul if you dropped anything onto the floor during a winter night. Congratulations, it was now part of the permafrost. Medieval peasants tried to fight this grim battle in a few ways. One method was layering thick mats of straw across the floor. If you could afford it, or more realistically, if you could steal enough from your neighbor's field without getting caught, you might have a decent insulating barrier. But straw flattened fast, got moldy even faster, and added an extra crunchy soundtrack to your already miserable nights. Some homes layered dried rushes onto the dirt instead. Every so often, they would throw fresh rushes on top, without cleaning out the old ones. Over time, this created a fascinating little ecosystem of decomposing plants, fleas, and whatever mystery creatures decided to move in. It was basically medieval carpet padding. If your carpet was alive, slightly damp, and smelled like a wet dog. Beds, for those who had them, didn't solve much either. They were usually little more than wooden frames packed with, you guessed it, more straw or hay. Instead of cozy mattresses, you got poking, shifting, crunchy layers that did little to block the cold radiating from below. Tossing and turning wasn't about comfort. It was a desperate, awkward dance to keep the blood flowing and avoid freezing one side of your body. The truth is, medieval peasants didn't conquer the icy ground. They simply learned to live uncomfortably above it. A good night's sleep wasn't about dreams or softness. It was about waking up with all your toes still attached. And if you could pull that off, hey, you were doing better than most. If medieval homes had a single hero during winter, it wasn't the roof or the walls, or even the brave layers of dirt and dung insulation. It was the hearth. A crackling, stubborn fire pit that served as the only real defense against the cold, the darkness, and the general gloom of medieval life. The center of nearly every peasant home was a simple fireplace with a fancy stone mantel and neat chimneys sweeping the smoke skyward. Instead, you had a basic pit or pile of stones, some half-burned logs, and enough smoke pouring into the room to make you wonder if you were slowly becoming a ham. That's right. Most homes didn't even have chimneys. The smoke just did its best. It drifted out through small holes in the roof, cracks in the walls, or straight into your lungs. If it was feeling lazy that evening, it wasn't ideal for breathing, or your overall lifespan. But on the bright side, it did a great job of fumigating fleas and other unwanted guests. Who needs pest control when you're marinating in smoke 24/7? The hearth wasn't just about warmth either. It was the kitchen, the light source, and sometimes even the medieval version of a television. People sat around the fire telling stories, gossiping, or just staring into the flames, because, frankly, there wasn't much else to do after sunset. Keeping the fire alive wasn't just a nice idea, it was mandatory. Letting the fire die out at night was like putting up a sign for the cold to come in and finish you off. Plus, reigniting a fire in winter wasn't as easy as striking a match. You had to work with flint, steel, kindling, and more prayers than you'd ever offered before. Everyone in the family had a duty. Stoking the flames, watching the embers, adding peat, sticks, or, if you were lucky, a precious piece of dry wood. It was a constant battle between human persistence and the smothering cold that wanted nothing more than to snuff you out. The hearth didn't guarantee survival, but without it, survival was downright impossible. It was a smoky, sputtering, often disappointing little fire, but in a medieval winter, it was the beating heart of hope. If there was one thing medieval peasants feared more than running out of ale, it was letting the fire go out overnight. Without that warm, flickering lifeline, the cold would creep in faster than a tax collector after harvest. And in the dead of winter, restarting a fire from scratch wasn't just inconvenient, it could be deadly. Matches didn't exist yet. Lighters? Dream on. Rekindling a fire meant striking flint and steel together, praying for a single precious spark, and then coddling that spark with tender love and whatever dry kindling you hadn't already burned days ago. Imagine trying to do all this in the freezing dark, half asleep with frozen fingers. Now add a hungry wolf howling in the distance for extra motivation. So peasants got smart. They banked the fire, not in a cozy savings account. Banking meant carefully burying the embers under a mound of ash right before bed. The ash acted like a blanket, insulating the glowing coals and keeping them alive just barely until morning. If you did it right, you could stroll over at sunrise, poke the pile a little, add fresh wood, and voila, fire without the frostbite. But if you did it wrong, well, let's just say mornings got a whole lot colder and a whole lot grumpier. Fire banking was an art passed down from parent to child like a prized family recipe. Everyone had their own little secrets. Some swore by using dry ash only. Others insisted a bit of dampness was key. Some packed the embers tight, others let them breathe. You could practically start a medieval argument just by suggesting a better fire banking method. It was the ancient version of arguing over barbecue techniques, just with slightly higher survival stakes. Sometimes, even banking the fire wasn't enough. A howling wind might sneak through a crack and snuff it out anyway. Or a clumsy sheep might stumble into the hearth. Yes, it happened. That's why some families took turns getting up in the night too. Check the coals. Basically the medieval equivalent of sleepwalking to the thermostat. In the end, fire banking wasn't about mastering nature. It was about buying just a few more precious hours of warmth. And if you woke up to even a single surviving ember, that was your victory right there, and enough to face another day of battling the cold. In medieval times, the phrase "the more the merrier" wasn't just about parties, it was a winter survival tactic. When the fire sputtered and the freezing winds whistled through every crack, there was one surefire source of warmth: each other. And if that meant sleeping cheek to cheek with your entire family, neighbors, livestock, and possibly a very confused goose, so be it. Forget about personal space. Privacy wasn't even a concept. On the coldest nights, the goal wasn't comfort. It was, don't wake up frozen to the floor. Entire households piled into the warmest corner of the house, wrapped in whatever scraps of cloth they could find, and formed what could best be described as a desperate, snoring human lasagna. Younger kids squeezed in between parents, grandparents snuggled under the outer layers, and if Cousin Ethel showed up unexpectedly, well, there was always room for one more. If you were lucky, you got to sleep in the middle, where body heat radiated from all sides. If you were unlucky, you were on the edge, the medieval equivalent of sleeping next to the door of a meat locker, and woe to the person who moved too much during the night. You shift once to get comfortable, and suddenly you've knocked Aunt Maud into the freezing draft by the wall. Congratulations, you're now the family villain. Sometimes even bedding was shared, a communal straw mattress that slowly flattened under the nightly weight of multiple generations. And because hygiene wasn't exactly winning any awards back then, let's just say it wasn't the most fragrant sleeping arrangement. But hey, when it's you versus frostbite, you stop being picky. Body heat wasn't just nice, it was strategic. Some medieval guides even recommended deliberately arranging the strongest, warmest people on the outside of the group, like human shields against the cold. Babies and frail elders were tucked deep in the center, treated like the precious little heat generators they were. This wasn't just about survival, though, over time, it became part of daily life, part of family bonding. Long winter nights huddled together led to storytelling, singing, and undoubtedly some very interesting conversations muffled under a shared wool blanket. So next time your sibling steals your blanket or your dog hogs the bed, just remember, at least you're not fighting for elbow space between a snoring uncle and a particularly judgmental goat. That if you thought modern roommates were a challenge, medieval peasants would like to introduce you to their winter housemates. Cows, goats, pigs, chickens, basically anything with a pulse and a little bit of body heat. Bringing animals indoors wasn't just a quirky village tradition, it was vital for survival. Livestock generated warmth, and in a poorly insulated hovel where the wind howled louder than your stomach, every little degree mattered. Plus, if your goat shared a wall with you, it was slightly less likely to get stolen by a neighbor in the dead of night. 2 birds. One stinky stone at a night. The house became a chaotic living furnace. Chickens nested in corners, pigs snorted near the hearth, and cows lounged luxuriously against the walls. Chewing cud like they paid rent. It wasn't glamorous. Far from it. If you've ever been stuck in a car on a summer road trip with someone who forgot to shower, imagine that. But it's a cow. It's winter, and there's literally nowhere else to go. The smells? Legendary. By springtime. The perfume of a shared winter was something fierce. You didn't need to light a candle. Your nostrils were already on a wild ride. But medieval peasants developed a selective nose. They didn't complain much because they knew one uncomfortable truth. The more animals inside, the fewer frozen toes in the morning. Certain animals even had prime spots. Cows, being the biggest and warmest, usually took center stage near the family. Goats were allowed closer in for their warmth, and because goats being goats would find a way inside anyway. Chickens roost in rafters or old baskets. And pigs, well, pigs didn't care. They plopped down wherever they pleased, probably right in the middle of the floor. Of course, sharing your bedroom with livestock wasn't without hazards. Imagine drifting off peacefully, only to be rudely awakened by a chicken deciding your hair makes a good perch. Or stepping barefoot into something suspicious first thing in the morning. Yes, medieval mornings could be full of surprises. Still, despite the noise, the smells, and the occasional hoof to the ribs, peasants understood the simple math. Cold kills and cows cuddle. Whether they want to or not, die in the battle against winter's icy fingers. A warm, slightly slobbery cow breath was often the deciding factor between life and death. In medieval winters, fashion wasn't about looking good. It was about not dying. Peasants weren't flipping through the latest trends. They were layering up like they were preparing for battle against the grim reaper himself. The rule was simple. If you owned it, you wore it. Sometimes all at once. First, the basic undertunic, a scratchy, probably not too clean linen shirt. Over that, a thicker woolen tunic. Then another, if you had it. Add some leggings that sagged at the knees, a rough cloak draped over your shoulders, and, if you were really lucky, a patched-up sheepskin thrown on top like a prize trophy. Congratulations, you were now approximately 10% warmer and 90% itchier. Boots were a luxury. Many peasants wrapped their feet in layers of cloth or old rags and stuffed them into wooden clogs. If the cold still bit through, well, you just added another rag and hoped you didn't lose a toe. And forget about washing all these layers. Washing your clothes in the middle of winter meant dragging them to a frozen stream, smashing through the ice, and then waiting 2 days for your only shirt to dry. If it didn't just freeze into a tragic shirt cycle. Most peasants wisely decided that smelling like a mix of smoke, sweat, and sheep was a small price to pay for not freezing solid. Interestingly, the dirt and grease buildup had a bonus feature: insulation. That grimy layer locked in body heat. It was like a medieval Gore-Tex jacket, just smellier and far less socially acceptable today. Hats, scarves, and gloves were prized treasures. A simple woolen cap could mean the difference between making it through the night or waking up with hair frozen to the wall. Gloves were often homemade from whatever scraps of leather or fabric people could scrounge, sometimes looking more like sad puppet costumes than anything fashionable. Children were especially swaddled until they resembled overstuffed turnips, waddling awkwardly around the house. The goal was to trap as much precious body heat as possible. Style, elegance, never heard of them. Warmth was the real medieval flex, so the next time you complain about layering up for a chilly day, just remember, medieval peasants walked around wearing half their wardrobe at once, looking like lumpy laundry bags and counting themselves lucky for it. In the medieval peasant playbook, dirt wasn't just something you scrubbed off. It was practically a survival tool. As it turns out, getting grimy wasn't a sign you'd given up on life. It was tactical. strategic, dare we say genius. See, winter posed a very specific problem: heat loss. Clean clothes, especially freshly laundered linen, were surprisingly terrible at keeping you warm. They were breathable, sure, but when the air temperature hovered somewhere between hypothermia and instant regret, breathable wasn't exactly a selling point. That's where dirt came in as peasants trudged through day after day without washing their clothing. Layers of grime, natural body oils, and good old-fashioned mud began to build up on their tunics, cloaks, and leggings. Over time, this natural armor clogged the tiny gaps in the fabric, making clothes more wind-dash resistant. That IT was like medieval weatherproofing, just smellier. Sure, you smelled like a goat who lost a bet, but guess what? You were warm. In fact, some medieval folks believed that washing yourself too often in winter could actually make you sick. Better to keep that protective, holy filth barrier intact. Bathing was rare, laundry even rarer, and soap, when it existed, was reserved for serious occasions like when the bishop showed up or maybe right before you died. Adding to the strategy, peasants layered their clothes without changing the ones underneath. It was about not dying. Peasants weren't flipping through the latest trends. They were layering up like they were preparing for battle against the grim reaper himself. The rule was simple. If you owned it, you wore it. Sometimes all at once. First, the basic undertunic, a scratchy, probably not too clean linen shirt. Over that, a thicker woolen tunic. Then another, if you had it. Add some leggings that sagged at the knees, a rough cloak draped over your shoulders, and, if you were really lucky, a patched-up sheepskin thrown on top like a prize trophy. Congratulations, you were now approximately 10% warmer and 90% itchier. Boots were a luxury. Many peasants wrapped their feet in layers of cloth or old rags and stuffed them into wooden clogs. If the cold still bit through, well, you just added another rag and hoped you didn't lose a toe. And forget about washing all these layers. Washing your clothes in the middle of winter meant dragging them to a frozen stream, smashing through the ice, and then waiting 2 days for your only shirt to dry, if it didn't just freeze into a tragic shirt cycle. Most peasants wisely decided that smelling like a mix of smoke, sweat, and sheep was a small price to pay for not freezing solid. Interestingly, the dirt and grease buildup had a bonus feature: insulation. That grimy layer locked in body heat. It was like a medieval Gore-Tex jacket, just smellier and far less socially acceptable today. Hats, scarves, and gloves were prized treasures. A simple woolen cap could mean the difference between making it through the night or waking up with hair frozen to the wall. Gloves were often homemade from whatever scraps of leather or fabric people could scrounge, sometimes looking more like sad puppet costumes than anything fashionable. Children were especially swaddled until they resembled overstuffed turnips, waddling awkwardly around the house. The goal was to trap as much precious body heat as possible. Style, elegance, never heard of them. Warmth was the real medieval flex. So, the next time you complain about layering up for a chilly day, just remember, medieval peasants walked around wearing half their wardrobe at once, looking like lumpy laundry bags and counting themselves lucky. For it in the medieval peasant playbook, dirt wasn't just something you scrubbed off. It was practically a survival tool. As it turns out, getting grimy wasn't a sign you'd given up on life. It was tactical, strategic, dare we say genius. See, winter posed a very specific problem: heat loss. Clean clothes, especially freshly laundered linen, were surprisingly terrible at keeping you warm. They were breathable, sure, but when the air temperature hovered somewhere between hypothermia and instant regret, breathable wasn't exactly a selling point. That's where dirt came in as peasants trudged through day after day without washing their clothing. Layers of grime, natural body oils, and good old-fashioned mud began to build up on their tunics, cloaks, and leggings. Over time, this natural armor clogged the tiny gaps in the fabric, making clothes more wind-dash resistant. It was like medieval weatherproofing, just smellier. Sure, you smelled like a goat who lost a bet, but guess what? You were warm. In fact, some medieval folks believed that washing yourself too often in winter could actually make you sick. Better to keep that protective, holy filth barrier intact. Bathing was rare, laundry even rarer, and soap, when it existed, was reserved for serious occasions, like when the bishop showed up, or maybe right before you died. Adding to the strategy, peasants layered their clothes without changing the ones underneath. You just threw your new layer on top of last month's. Eventually, you became a walking museum of the past 6 weeks. Every stain telling the heroic story of that one time I slipped in the mud but didn't die. To outside observers, medieval peasants might have looked and smelled like they had completely given up on hygiene. But the peasants knew better. That grimy, crusty tunic was a thermal shield against death by frostbite. It wasn't glamorous, but neither was freezing to death because you wanted to smell like flowers. Besides, in a world where literally everyone stank to high heaven, you weren't offending anyone. Nose blindness was practically a way of life, so yes, in medieval winters, filth wasn't failure. It was fashion. It was function. And if you had a thick, greasy outer layer by February, you, my friend, were winning at life. If you thought medieval peasants spent their winters tucked into plush feather beds with embroidered quilts, think again. The reality was a bit more rustic. And by rustic, I mean let's sleep on a pile of dead plants and hope for the best. Beds in the medieval peasant world were usually a rough wooden frame, if you could afford one, covered with a big sack stuffed full of straw, hay, or old rushes. That's no memory foam, no orthopedic support, no five-star hotel experience. Just a crunchy, lumpy, slightly pokey mess that smelled faintly of barnyard and regret. Every toss and turn in the night brought a delightful soundtrack of crinkling straw and the occasional sharp jab from a rogue stork. Some peasants even skipped the wooden frame altogether and just threw the straw straight onto the dirt floor, creating a luxurious, ground-level sleeping experience that modern influencers would probably rebrand as earth-connected slumber. The straw mattresses weren't just uncomfortable, they were temporary. Over time, the straw flattened, grew moldy, attracted bugs, and generally turned into a biological hazard zone. Changing the straw was a big event, usually done a few times a year if you were diligent, or whenever your bed started actively moving without your permission. Rushes were a popular alternative. These long grasses were spread thick on the floor, sometimes mixed with herbs like lavender or rosemary to mask the overwhelming odor livestock aroma of daily life. Fresh rushes smelled lovely for about a day. After that, they became part of the muddy, trampled landscape inside the house, blending seamlessly with dirt, food scraps, and whatever else wandered in. And let's not forget the bedfellows. Fleas, lice, and other charming critters loved straw bedding almost as much as the peasants did. If you woke up scratching more than you slept, congratulations, you were living the authentic medieval experience. Despite the hardships, these humble beds were lifesavers. Piles of straw provided a crucial insulating layer against the frozen earth, and clumping together atop them created pockets of shared body heat. Medieval central heating at its finest, so next time you sink into your soft, supportive mattress, just remember, somewhere out there, a medieval peasant is looking down at you from history, grinning through a mouthful of missing teeth and saying, "Must be nice." When you live in a house made of sticks, mud, and optimism, you quickly learn that winter breezes aren't just a nuisance, they're personal attacks. Medieval peasants didn't just fight the cold from the outside, they fought it from inside their own homes, armed with nothing but whatever they could cram into the cracks. And trust me, there were a lot of cracks. Walls warped, mud crumbled, thatch sagged. The cold seemed to find new places to sneak in every night, like a mischievous poltergeist with a grudge. Sealing up the house became an art form. Peasants stuffed gaps with moss, straw, scraps of old cloth, bundles of dry grass, and sometimes even animal hair. If it was soft, squishy, or vaguely insulating, it was jammed into a hole somewhere. Some particularly determined souls daubed extra layers of mud and dung over the outside of their walls as an annual winter project. Imagine standing there in freezing weather, slapping cold manure onto your own house while muttering, "This is fine, this is luxury," because in a way it was. Roof leaks were another battlefield. Thatch, while cheap and plentiful, wasn't exactly waterproof, especially after a few seasons of rain and snow. Peasants would plug holes in the roof with spare bits of cloth, bundles of reeds, or, in moments of true desperation, chunks of turf stolen from the nearest field. Every home eventually started to look like a slightly sad patchwork quilt made by someone who gave up halfway through. Doors, windows, if you had them, you were lucky. But even then, they were little more than wood planks hung by iron nails and sheer stubbornness. Window holes were often covered with animal hides or thick cloth soaked in animal fat to block out the worst drafts and add a bonus aroma of mystery meat to the living space. Every night was a battle between human ingenuity and the relentless sneaky cold point. 1 minute you were warm, the next minute a sudden gust would find the one spot you missed, slapping you awake like a frosty hand of doom. Yet, somehow, through cleverness, stubbornness, and a refusal to accept slightly frozen as a permanent state of being, medieval peasants patched, stuffed, and muddled their way through the worst winters nature could throw at them, one muddy handful at a time. When the cold bites hard enough to keep you awake at night, medieval peasants had a solution. Don't even try to pretend everyone's sleeping at once. Instead, they developed a survival strategy that today would make any military commander proud. Sleeping in shifts. It wasn't some grand, organized system with whistles and roll calls. It was far simpler and much more desperate. Half the household stayed awake, tending to the fire and patching up stray drafts, while the other half curled up under threadbare blankets. The fire was the center of the universe. Not in some poetic, philosophical way, I mean literally. Everything revolved around it. Sleep, conversation, meals, silence. The fire wasn't just warmth. It was protection. It was hope. It was the reason you didn't wake up as a medieval popsicle. And that's why peasants treated it like royalty. Someone was always feeding it, poking it, blowing on it like it owed them money. If the fire went out in the middle of the night, panic followed. Not because of the cold, no, because restarting a fire in freezing temperatures with soggy firewood and numb fingers was its own form of medieval torture. Shift sleeping became the solution. Half the house stayed awake, guarding the flames like sacred treasure. The other half huddled under blankets so thin you could read a Bible through them. There were no alarms, no chore charts, no sweet, gentle wake-ups. Just a grunt, a nudge, and a whispered, "Your turn." And if you were lucky, the person waking you hadn't just stepped in manure before crawling into bed. Keeping the fire alive was survival. Losing it was a death sentence. It wasn't even about warmth anymore, it was about control. It was the one thing they could keep alive in a world that tried so hard to kill everything else. But sometimes, despite all efforts, the fire died. The moment you stepped outside, reality hit you in the face, usually in the form of wind and regret. Your shoes, if you had them, were thin leather flaps tied with hope and string. Your feet were always cold, always damp, always dangerously close to turning black. Work didn't wait. The animals still needed tending, the water still needed fetching, and the fields, yes, even in winter, demanded your presence. You weren't farming in the snow, of course. You were doing winter prep, chopping firewood, collecting kindling, checking that the animals hadn't frozen to death in the night, shoveling out manure so the next round could move in. Manure was the gift that kept on giving. It smelled like failure and warmed like success. Sometimes dry dung was burned as fuel. You couldn't afford to be picky. If it caught fire, it was useful. That's it. That's the rule. And let's talk about water for a second. Fetching water in winter was a mini-game of pain. You walked, often barefoot, to the nearest stream, river, or well, shattered the ice, and hauled back heavy sloshing buckets that immediately tried to freeze again. Did it leak? Yes. Did your hands go numb? Definitely. Did you consider drinking snow instead? Probably. But you did it anyway. Because no matter how broken you were, you still had to keep going. Half the household stayed awake, tending to the fire and patching up stray drafts, while the other half curled up under threadbare blankets. This wasn't comfort. This was strategy. Because in the deepest throes of winter, sleep was a resource you had to ration like grain. And sometimes, it wasn't even about staying warm. It was about staying alive long enough for spring to arrive. The fire wasn't just a heat source. It was hope, flickering in the dark. The moment it went out, it wasn't just cold, it was danger, darkness, death. Maybe. So you took turns. You poked embers, shifted logs, stared into the glowing coals as if they were whispering some ancient truth. And when it was your turn to sleep, you buried your face into straw, pulled a damp wool cloth over your body, and hoped the cold didn't chew your toes off by morning. If you were lucky, someone had remembered to stash away a little food, a dried onion, some shriveled parsnips, maybe even a handful of sad, wrinkly beans. Meals were less about taste and more about survival-themed stew roulette. You tossed everything into a pot, added questionable water, and stirred until the mush stopped looking like ingredients and started looking like gray. Salt was rare. Spices? Forget it. The only thing you were seasoning with was desperation and a faint sprinkle of soot. Sometimes you'd get lucky and catch a rat. Yes, a rat. And yes, you ate it. Roasted if you were fancy, charred if you weren't, and always shared with your family like it was a roast goose. Because in winter, even the most pathetic meal was a feast. Winter dragged, not like a lazy river, like a cursed swamp you couldn't get out of. Every day looked like the one before, gray, wet, and cold enough to make your bones beg for mercy. Your fingers cracked, your lips bled. You wore the same crusty clothes until they became part of your skin. And still, you waited for the sun, for green, for a single sign that the world wasn't dying. But it never came quickly. And in the meantime, people got sick. Coughing wasn't just annoying, it was terrifying. A small fever could turn into a funeral by the week's end. And the worst part? You couldn't afford to rest. You coughed while chopping wood. You coughed while feeding the fire. You coughed while praying not to die. No medicine. No doctor. Just warm ale, bad advice, and prayers. People whispered about the chill sickness. A creeping, invisible shadow that wrapped around your lungs and squeezed until you stopped breathing. If someone in the house got sick, you didn't isolate them. You couldn't. You just hoped their breath didn't kill the rest of you. There was one thing stronger than the cold stories around the fire. As snow clawed at the roof and wind screamed through the gaps, you'd hear tales. Some true, some wildly made up, all magical. The time old Tomas fought off a wolf with a spoon. The time a traveling monk made cheese so holy it cured a toothache. The story of a ghost girl who danced on the frost every February, and if you left her bread, she'd bless your harvest. Stories gave warmth to places even fire couldn't reach. Your heart, your hope, your soul. Even when your toes were frozen and your stomach was empty, a good tale could make you believe spring was coming. Sometimes your feet went numb for so long you weren't sure they were still there. You'd stamp them, wiggle them, curse them, and every peasant, young, old, grumpy, had that same ritual, checking their toes in the morning. 1, 2, 3. Still got 'em. That was a win. There were days you cried, and nights you prayed, and mornings when you woke up to realize someone in the house hadn't. But you kept going, because what else could you do? You still had to feed the chickens, or the one chicken you hadn't eaten. Still had to break ice in the bucket to wash your face. Still had to patch that same old roof again. And still you watched, one day, and it always came like a miracle. The snow softened. You stepped outside, still wrapped in layers of your own grime and grief. And there it was, a patch of earth. Brown, wet, glorious. You knelt, you touched it, You whispered to it. And then, one morning, a flower pushed through the dirt like it had something to prove that it wasn't beautiful. Not yet, but it was real. And in that moment, every frozen night, every starving day, every tear and every cough, it all meant something. You had made it. Spring didn't ride in on a white horse. Tiptoed in, careful and quiet. A bird call here, a green bud there. The days grew longer. The winds grew softer. The death grip of winter began to loosen. But the truth is, spring wasn't the hero. You were. The peasant who stuffed mud in the walls, who took turns sleeping, who wore filth like armor and fought off cold with nothing but straw and stubbornness. You had no wealth, no help, no fleece-lined boots or emergency rations. You had only your fire, your hands, and your will. And that was enough. By late March, the icy winds became breezes. You opened the door, no longer to fight the cold, but to feel the light. Children stepped out barefoot for the first time in months, squealing at the mud. You laughed, a real laugh. You aired the bedding, burned the worst of the straw, and sat with your neighbors in the sun, faces tilted skyward, eyes closed. That wasn't just survival. That was triumph. You didn't just live through winter. You beat it. Years later, when people wrote books about knights and kings and wars, they forgot you. They forgot the woman who layered tunics until she looked like a haystack. The boy who caught a rat and cooked it for his mother. The father who patched the roof with his last sack. They forgot the stories you told and the fire you fed. But the truth is, you were the spine of history. Not the castle. Not the crown. You. If you ever find yourself cold, tired, broken, buried under the weight of something you can't quite name, remember them. The peasants, the poor, the forgotten. They didn't have comfort, but they had courage. And when the nights grew long and the winds howled like monsters, they didn't run. They stuffed the cracks. They stoked the fire. They held each other, and they survived. Close your eyes. Hear the wind against the thatch. Smell the smoke and straw. Feel the cold creeping in. And know, if they could make it through the dark, so can you.